Good morning, everyone. I'm Rex. Today, our group will present Apple's corporate social responsibility, focusing on sustainability, stakeholders, and global responsibility. Apple is one of the most influential technology companies in the world, and its business decisions affect millions of people globally. In this presentation, we will examine how Apple apply corporate social responsibility or CSR in real business situation and how it balance innovation, responsibility, and global impact. So why does Apple matter in a CSR discussion? Apple is a global technology leader that impacts stakeholders around the world, including customers, employees, suppliers, governments, shareholders, communities, and the environment. In addition, Apple influences important areas such as privacy, sustainability, and global production. For example, its decision can affect how personal data is protected and products are manufactured and how companies respond to environmental responsibility. Because of Apple's global influence, it is an important case study for understanding both the strengths and challenges of corporate social responsibility. Now that we understand why Apple is important, we will first use the social responsibility framework to evaluate Apple's CSR.
Hello everyone. Based on what Rex shared about Apple's global impact, let's look at Apple's corporate social responsibility using a simple four-part model: economic, legal, ethical, and creatable responsibility. First, economic responsibility means making profits and innovating. Apple performs well with high sales and loyal customers. Second, legal responsibility is following local laws worldwide. Apple generally complies, though doing business across many countries makes this hard. Third, ethical responsibility means doing the right things even if not required by law. Apple protects user privacy, such as its app tracking transparency rule. Fourth, charitable responsibility is helping society voluntarily. Apple runs education programs and supports local communities. However, these four responsibilities often conflict with each other. Take user privacy as an example. Apple's closed Apple Store claimed to protect privacy, is changed by US and European regulators for limiting fair competition. We may ask, is Apple protecting users or its own profits? Besides, frequent new product updates help Apple grow economically but created more electronic waste, conflicting with its environmental goals. This model is useful for analysis, but the key question is how Apple solves these real-world conflicts. Next, which groups are affected by these issues? Connie will talk about stakeholders for us.
Hey everyone, I'm Connie, and now let's talk about stakeholder orientations. In simple terms, this means a company should not only care about shareholders, but also consider every group affected by its decisions. For Apple, the main stakeholders include customers, employees, shareholders, suppliers, and factory workers, governments, communities, and the environment. Each group has different expectations. Customers want privacy and quality, employees want fair treatment, shareholders care about profit, suppliers and factory workers are affected by Apple's production standards and deadlines. Governments expect legal compliance, communities and the environment care about Apple's impact on waste, energy, and climate change. Apple does show stakeholder orientation in several ways. For example, it publishes environmental and supplier responsibility reports. It also makes privacy a core value for customers. These actions prove Apple understands different stakeholder concerns. However, there are still conflicts between stakeholder groups. Shareholders want faster product releases and higher profits, while environmental stakeholders want longer product life cycles and less electronic waste. Customers want new features every year, but factory workers may face more pressure. This is why Apple has to balance innovation, profit, privacy, labor conditions, and environmental responsibilities at the same time. Now, let's look at how Apple handles one of its biggest stakeholder groups, the environment.
This slide shows Apple's sustainability performance through several key numbers. The first number is 2030, which represents Apple's goal to become carbon neutral across its entire business, manufacturing, supply chain, and product life cycle by 2030. This is important because Apple's environmental impact does not only come from its office, but also from production, transportation, product use, and recycling. The second number is 100%, which shows Apple's effort to use recycled key materials in some product components. This helps reduce the need for newly mined resources. The 300 plus clean energy suppliers also shows that Apple is pushing new renewable electricity across its supply chain, not just within its own company. The 95% supplier commitment further suggested that most major suppliers are involved in Apple's environmental goals. Finally, the 40 million plus fiber-based packaging point shows Apple's effort to reduce plastic and make packaging more sustainable. However, Apple still faces a limitation. Its business depends on frequent product upgrades, which can create electronic waste. So, Apple's next challenge is not only greener production, but also longer product life, easier repair, and more responsible consumption. Next, I will discuss Apple supply chain responsibility.
This part focuses on global responsibility and supply chain responsibility. Since Apple is a global company, its CSR cannot only focus on the United States. Apple's products are designed, manufactured, assembled, shipped, and sold across many countries. This means Apple needs to consider global stakeholders. One important issue is supply labor responsibility. Apple works with many suppliers and factories around the world. These suppliers are connected to workers' wages, working hours, safety conditions, and labor rights. Apple has supplier standards and audits to manage these issues. For example, Apple's own Supply Responsibility Progress Report shows that while most suppliers comply with the 60-hour work week limit, some factories still exceed it. In 2018, 94% of suppliers were compliant, which means 6%, dozens of factories were not. This shows that even with audits, global supply chains are very complex. It is difficult to fully control every factory and every subcontractor. Another issue is responsible sourcing. Apple uses minerals and materials from different parts of the world. Some materials may be connected to environmental damage or human rights problems. Therefore, Apple needs to check where its materials come from and whether suppliers follow ethical standards. Apple's global responsibility shows both strengths and weaknesses. On the positive side, Apple has public supply reports, responsible sourcing programs, and clean energy requirements for suppliers. These actions show that Apple understands its global impact.
However, the limitation is transparency. Stakeholders may still question whether Apple can fully monitor all suppliers. If problems happen in the supply chain, Apple's CSR reputation can be damaged, even if the problem is not directly inside Apple's own offices. These examples shows that Apple has strong CSR practices, but they also reveal several stakeholder gaps.
In this final part, I will focus on Apple's ethics, key CSR gaps, our original insights, and the overall conclusion. Let me start with ethics. A strong example of Apple's ethical responsibility is user privacy. Apple presents privacy as a basic human right. For example, through Apple Tracking Transparency. This goes beyond legal compliance. It is an ethical choice that builds customer trust. However, ethics is not only about what a company says, but also about the trade-offs it makes. As mentioned above, there are 3 CSR gaps. First, the sustainability replacement gap. Apple talks about carbon neutrality, but its business still pushes people to buy new iPhone every year. That creates electronic waste. Second, the privacy control gap. Apple protects users from third-party tracking, but it also tightly controls its Apple Store. Some say Apple uses privacy as an excuse to limit competition. Third, the responsibility, transparency gap. Apple has supplier standards, but the supply chain is so complex that stakeholders can't fully verify everything. This hurts Apple's CSR credibility. From this case, we develop 3 original insights. Privacy can be a CSR asset, not just a cost or compliance issue. It creates brand trust. Product replacement creates a structural sustainability tension. Innovation and environmental goals are not always aligned. CSR credibility depends on verifiable transparency. Without independent evidence, even good promises can be questioned. In conclusion, Apple is a strong CSR performer, but not a perfect one. Apple shows that a global company can be both innovative and responsible. However, CSR is not an endpoint. It requires continuous balance between profit, sustainability, privacy, and the real-world impacts on all stakeholders. Thank you for your listening.